Hi, everyone. This is Matt with ESI Survival Guide, an online resource to help legal professionals navigate the electronic wilderness. Every week we have new content, so please subscribe. And if you like this video, feel free to give us a thumbs up, share, and comments. But today is a very special event edition of the guide. We are joined by our friend, our mates, if you will, if you're watching from the UK or from Australia, our privacy compatriot, and one of the top experts in data privacy, cross-border data movements, and all points in between, Jonathan Armstrong, partner with Cordery out of London. Jonathan is here with us to celebrate the third birthday of the GDPR. Jonathan, how are you doing, sir?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing good.
Nice to see you.
Trying to get into the festive mood here for the birthday.
Nice to see you entering into the spirit of it all.
Yeah, I'm trying. But welcome, Jonathan. I'm so glad to have you here. And geez, like where does the time go? They really do grow up so fast, don't they?
Yeah, that's right. I was looking back at my notes from January 2012, which was the day that what is now GDPR was announced. And it's amazing. I agree with you. It's amazing how quickly the time has flown. It
seems like it was just yesterday. GDPR was crawling around in diapers. Everybody was freaking out about the two-tiered fines. And now our GDPR is walking, doesn't cry when we go off to work. We're starting to potty train. And there's some maturity that's developing around enforcement. And it's interesting because my 5-year-old, when he was 3, had some challenges with that last one. So I'm pretty impressed with how the GDPR is developing. But to celebrate GDPR's third birthday, big number 3.
Impressive.
The third birthday, I want to talk about some enforcement trends. But first, Jonathan, what would a birthday be without some cake? But unfortunately, I told you I was going to get some cupcakes. I wasn't able to get them in time. So I don't think we're going to be able to do that, unfortunately. But,
you'd be welcome. You'd be welcome.
You got one. Hey, you know what? Hey, real quick. I want to try something. So there's a little known Zoom feature, the teleportation feature. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. It's not part of the base plan or the professional plan or even the enterprise plan. I think there's a quantum mechanics plan. It's pretty expensive, but I think we can get a free version of it. Why don't we try and do this? So I'm going to hit this button. I think it's Control-Alt. Cupcake icon, and here, see if you can pass it to me through the interface. So
I'm passing.
Okay. Oh, I see it. Okay. Perfect. Hey, look at that.
Phenomenal.
So
now that's magic.
I take back what I said. We do have a cupcake to celebrate the GDPR's third birthday. In the spirit of that, let me give a little light here. 1. Hopefully I don't set all these streamers on fire.
Now I know why Penn and Teller retired then, Matt.
Right. So, and of course, what would a birthday be without a song? So if I may, happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday, dear GDPR, happy birthday to you. Here we go.
You sound like a wedding singer, Matt.
I don't know if is that a compliment? I think I just got a Jonathan Byrne right there. And just for those of you out there, I am able to sing happy birthday. The copyright expired. I think it went to the public domain in 2017 in the EU, and a federal court invalidated the claim in 2016. And that was educational, informational, and newsworthy. So if there's anything such as fair use, I'm pretty sure that that's it. So Jonathan, now let's jump right into talking about some trends. Now, if I can, let me set the stage a little bit. So in 2018, when GDPR first came out, you saw a lot of complaints, but very little enforcement. And surprisingly to many, the fines were fairly conservative. I remember when we used to talk about the GDPR before its implementation, everybody was freaking out about that two-tiered fine structure. The 10 million euro and 2% of annual turnover on the low tier and double that respectively on the higher tier. But GDPR came out, every corporation didn't go bankrupt, and the world didn't end. That was an interesting trend. We saw in that first year, Germany had the most fines, but France had the highest. Little shout out to Germany here, France here. And early on, you also saw countries like Belgium and Latvia essentially treat the first 7 months as almost like a grace period, where they were engaging industry to educate as opposed to enforce. Countries like Austria and Denmark were really going after lower level activity as opposed to those banner cases like you saw with Germany and France. And then in 2019, you saw enforcement really pick up with those multi-million euro fines coming out. You saw the 50 million euro fine against Google from the French CNIL. Austria had an 18 million euro fine that was later overturned. And then enforcement really skyrocketed in 2020. You saw the Irish Data Protection Commission really emerge as a leader in these enforcement actions against big tech. You began to see Italy posting some big fines. The usual suspects like the CNIL were still there. And you saw recently the Dutch also emerge really strongly with some enforcement actions. And actually, in another segment, Jonathan, we're going to be talking about the locatefamily.com and the booking.com enforcement actions. And then also, shout out to Spain with my gator. I'm vaccinated, but I still wear a mask. So I got this to honor Spain having the most number of enforcement actions. So while Italy has the highest dollar amount, you see Spain emerging really on a tear with having the most number of enforcement actions. And with regards to some of these bigger enforcement actions that are reported in the news, you would think that the underlying reasons for most of the enforcement actions would be security failures. But what you're really seeing is a broad range of underlying reasons. Under Article 5, you're seeing enforcement for processing of personal data. Under Article 7 with consent issues. So it really is a broad range. So Jonathan, as we near the halfway mark of 2021, what trends have you seen that have emerged over the past 5 months with GDPR enforcement?
Well, I think that was a really helpful introduction, Matt. I think you're right that there is dissonance across the EU, but I think that was predictable. I think you're right that that some DPAs were slow out of the box. Again, I think that was predictable. Nobody sensible expected 26th of May 2018 to be an opening of the floodgates. And part of the reason for that, you've alluded to with the Austrian fine. These fines are challengeable. If you look at Germany, some of the earliest fines, Deutsche Wohnen 1 and 1, have been challenged through the courts. And we know from antitrust experience, my colleague Andre Bywater did some of the early antitrust cases where the fines were also reduced or withdrawn. So good DPAs have taken the time to stack their investigation up properly, and that does take time, and that's why we're seeing a real increase in activity at the moment, as those sort of 3 years of hard work are coming to fruition. So you're right that enforcement across the EU has been somewhat patchy. You know, Latvia, Ireland, Portugal, only 4 cases each in terms of fines. But Portugal, for example, has still brought some significant cases this year. The Cloudflare suspension is very significant, I think. Ireland obviously has been criticised at an EU level, but again, Ireland has done non-fine remedies against Facebook, for example, where Facebook suspended its dating service in Europe after a dawn raid from the authorities there. And you're right that the figures are interesting. Italy, I think, is, to my mind, the most interesting in that it's got 77-ish fines now that are fairly substantial. You're right that Spain's got the most numbers on the block, 248, I think, as we speak. Some of those are for trivial amounts, but one of the trends we've seen this year is some bigger fines from Spain, and that's obviously going to affect the numbers considerably. We're hovering around the 300 million euros mark at the moment in terms of total fines, 795 total actions. The other message, of course, is one of transparency, though. Sometimes DPAs are taking action and you don't find out about it that easily. Germany being one such nation. So sometimes we're struggling to get metrics, but what we can certainly say, if we're looking for sort of 5 quick trends, one is certainly that enforcement is on the rise, and that will continue through the rest of 2021. And you're right in saying that regulators are being more persistent. We've certainly seen upskilling from many regulators across the EU. They're asking more detailed questions and more relevant questions after a data breach, particularly. And you're also right in saying that this ain't just about data breaches. And sometimes the data breach report leads you to something else. So H&M would be the most obvious example, a fine of some 35 million euros from memory, brought to the attention of the DPA because of a security breach, but then the regulator looks at all of those things you talked about, transparency and consent, and said, well, hang on, why did you have this data in the first place? So sometimes the security breach notification is just the sort of the fire bell that makes people inspect the rest of the processes and procedures that you've got inside your organization. I think maybe 4 other trends I'd say. Militancy. We're certainly seeing a lot more militancy in the EU. So more individuals exercising their subject access requests in things like internal investigations, people trying to restrict processing, exercise right to be forgotten, etc., etc. So I think that's definitely a trend we're seeing across our desks. Not cakes, but cookies. There's a real enforcement trend with them as well. So we're tracking, I think, 7 different countries in the last 2 months or so have brought cookie enforcement action, and a lot more civil claims there. And there are some big civil claims kicking through the system, not just Schrems 2, the civil action after Schrems 1, but also all sorts of other claims like the Google Safari case in the UK. Many more threatened class actions. We see maybe 1, maybe 2 a month across our desks. Some of them not particularly well framed as yet, but definitely a lot of aggression there. I think the third concentration is this whole data transfer piece. Of course, that's in some respects a parallel development to GDPR with the Schrems litigation, etc. That's rolling on. This morning, the DPC in Ireland gave Facebook 6 weeks to respond to its complaints about the way in which Facebook handles data. And obviously, that doesn't just affect big business. You know, we've seen cases like the Cloudflare activity I talked about, the private civil action in Munich, some other cases up in Scandinavia against transfer of data to China, for example. So I think that's definitely an area to watch. Obviously, we've got these changes to standard contractual clauses. We've got Brexit that makes that whole data transfer piece more difficult as well. Fourth trend, you've alluded to it already, security. Definitely bigger challenges there, particularly with things like ransomware. Obviously, as we speak, we're about to see whether a ransomware gang hold good on their promise to release health data of almost every Irish citizen into the public domain, and we're waiting with bated breath. And I know many of my colleagues in Ireland are particularly worried about it today. Similar activity going on in New Zealand. UK health sector has been targeted in the past and continues to be targeted. So the threats are very different, and working from home threats are different as well, because we don't have that check and balance of somebody being in the office. And also from my experience, some corporations have loosed their security practices to enable people to work from home, to enable them to access home printers, etc., etc. And a lot of these ransomware gangs are incredibly well resourced, incredibly good at working out how corporations work and exploiting those vulnerabilities. And of course, some of them are protected by nation states, some of them are sponsored by nation states. So I think organizations are always going to be playing catch up there, because of course a ransomware gang can have 20,000 attempts to hack your system, and they only need to get lucky once, and you've got to get lucky 20,000 times.
Right.
And so those odds always mean that there's going to be issues. And then maybe the fifth thing I'd say is I'm seeing more issues around supply chain, and that means that good organizations are looking more at their supply chain, and not only just conventional vendors like payroll providers, but also their lawyers, their attorneys as well, asking them how they comply with GDPR, what measures they put in place, where the data is, how they protect their own supply chain, etc., etc. So we're seeing definitely data protection be a differentiator in that environment, and that's going to change as well because of something not GDPR related, tangentially, called the NIS directive, which protects critical national infrastructure in the EU, and the NIS directive is being expanded. So just in the same way, if you like, as the Biden administration with its proposed executive order has tried to look at critical national infrastructure and how the definition of CNI changes almost on a daily basis as other stuff becomes more essential to our operations, then the same is happening in the EU as well, with another 11 sectors, I think, coming into the CNI definition and therefore under the NIS directive. So 2021 is going to be a year of huge change as well, I think. Some of it building on the foundations that you've talked about, but some of it with new threats coming off the wall that regulators are going to respond to.
We also did a piece on Biden's executive order related to cybersecurity on the guide. For those of you that want to check out that, you can go and view that piece. But Jonathan, looking at the trends moving past the half-year mark into 2021, on the flip side of the regulatory environment and the enforcement environment, what are you seeing clients coming to you for in terms of the advice they need, the services they need? How are corporations meeting these challenges? Are they sitting back and waiting on how the regulatory actions and enforcement actions suss out? Or are they being proactive and coming to folks like you to try and get ahead of some of these changes?
Well, I would say, wouldn't I? Probably less proactive than many organizations ought to be. If you take subject access rights, for example, we've seen a huge uptick in subject access requests being made since September, October, November time, bigger in volume and more aggressive. In many of the cases that we've seen, organizations by some simple housekeeping could reduce that burden, but they're not. I know some of the surveys say that one subject access request alone can cost about $150,000 to comply with. When I was looking back just before we chatted at the note that I did in 2012, the day what's now GDPR was announced, I saw that the Commission had promised that GDPR will bring savings to business of, and I'll read you the figure, 2.3 billion euros per year will be saved by businesses through GDPR coming into place. 2.3 billion euros per year. That is what you might call baloney. There have been no savings to any business that I have seen through GDPR coming in, certainly not to the 2.3 billion euro level. And subject access requests are one of the big expenses. Now, of course, you could say, well, part of the expense is because businesses don't know where their data is and they're not using the right tools to extract that data. That is absolutely true, but there are all sorts of procedural things that people could do to improve, and obviously using the right technology and using the right systems and processes is one of those. So I don't think organizations are being as proactive as they might, and we still see many data breach reports where the compliance team or the legal team didn't know that they were using the vendor that's been breached, and that obviously has to stop.
Talking about that Austrian DPA matter we discussed that was overturned, do you envision that there are going to be more challenges to enforcement actions in these fines, or are the fines going to reach a leveling off point where there's an equilibrium, if you will, in the amount of fines with these types of challenges?
I think there's always going to be a fairly good hit rate on appeals against fines. And I think there are all sorts of reasons for that. Partly because some regulators aren't used to following proper processes and procedures. These are quasi-criminal proceedings in many jurisdictions, so you've got to follow the same careful process as if you were a prosecutor. And some data protection authorities just aren't geared up to do that, and they aren't in the right mindset to do that. I think also, whilst ever there is this great disparity across the EU, that in itself leaves room for challenge as well. You've only got to look at, for example, the information that the EDPB has released into the Twitter late data breach notification fine. And I haven't got the figures in front of me, but and I don't think the levels of fine are attributed to each DPA, but you've got one DPA saying that the fine should be whatever 20 million euros, and at the other extreme, one DPA saying that the fine should be 2 plates of paella and saying you're sorry. And whilst ever we've
that sounds like a reasonable fine.
And whilst ever we've got this whole range of potential fines, obviously anybody who's fined towards the top end is incentivized to say that their fine should be towards the bottom end. And the cost of bringing these appeals, again, I'm relying on my colleague, Mr. Bywater, who's done a few of them, but he tells me that the cost of doing these appeals is relatively insignificant if you do it at an EU level, because they're not as procedural as a US or a UK court might be. So the cost of bringing your appeal might be relatively small. And if you're sitting on a fine of 30 million euros, why wouldn't you throw that dice and see if you can get it reduced? So we are going to see many more fines in 2021, 2022. And it's interesting that if you look at the enforcement notices in some of the cases, the regulators are specifically saying, we have offered a discount, we've resolved this with the entity involved, and they are not going to appeal. So an H&M would be one, for example. So I think we're going to get to a stage where, unofficially at least, some DPAs are going to give discounts if you promise not to appeal.
And while I have you, before we go, Jonathan, although we're focused on the GDPR and the GDPR turning 3, I did want to give a shout out to the UK. I know that the UK was really ramping up enforcement in 2019 with some major fines. Do you envision any trends? It seems like once that adequacy decision, that discussion really picked up some steam, focus on that seemed to die down a little bit. But do you see the trend moving towards finalizing that adequacy decision? Or will there be some disputes, you think, between fines that maybe are issued by the ICO or fines that are issued from EU member states on UK-based organizations with regards to enforcement?
I think that's a great question, Matt. In some respects, we're at that interregnum, if you like. So the current vicar, Elizabeth Denham, has said that she's retiring. The new vicar's not been appointed, and the congregation are waiting to see what the new regime is going to bring. So we're in that space at the moment. Some people say that the Johnson administration wants to bring in a weak information commissioner, and some people say that's because some people in the close circle of Boris Johnson have fallen foul of data protection regulations, so they want to weaken enforcement. Elizabeth Denham's appointment was the first in the UK where we've almost followed your congressional process of having the candidate for Information Commissioner appear before the Commons. Now, it is appear before Parliament, so it is a government appointment, but will the government risk appointing somebody weak when they know that's going to involve a public hearing? So we don't really know the future direction of the ICO because we don't really know who the next commissioner is. Spoiler alert, it's not me. If it was me, it's relatively easy for the information commissioner to get numbers on the board at the moment, because you can take fines like locate family that I know we're going to talk about later. You can say you didn't appoint a data protection representative in the EU. By the way, you didn't appoint one in the UK either. So we're also going to fine you that under UK GDPR. So you've just paid the Dutch authorities, here's the card machine. Swipe here as well, please. So I think it's going to be relatively easy to issue mirror investigations. I think it should be relatively easy as well for the ICO to still cooperate at an EU level if both parties see common sense. And so you could get to a stage, the ICO is still resourced, I believe, better than any other European Data Protection Authority, in part because we still have the registration system, which still brings in money in addition to money that comes from central government funds. So if I were an EU data protection commissioner, I'd still welcome the support of the UK in joint investigations. And that seems to me that would be the sensible path forward in enforcement. This is Europe, so the sensible solution isn't always the solution that's adopted. As far as adequacy is concerned, of course, that debate is going to rumble on. We now know, no surprises here, that the European Parliament isn't keen. They never were keen. They never would be keen, partly because of allegations that GCHQ intercepted the mail of some MEPs. So that was always entirely predictable. Is it a permanent stumbling block to an adequacy decision? I don't think so. Will it delay matters? Possibly. Will it mean that the European Commission want ongoing supervision, which they'd said they wanted in the draft adequacy decision, the 4-year review, etc., etc.? Will it be that those mechanisms toughen up? I guess so. But of course, the European Parliament have also said that the EU should bring enforcement proceedings against Ireland, because they say that Ireland aren't adequately enforcing the rules. We've got Slovenia, which still hasn't introduced GDPR. We've got the French data protection regulators criticizing their own government for failure to comply with data protection principles when using drones to surveil French citizens. So there's no black and white position here on what adequacy looks like. And I think as a result, that debate's going to rage for many years to come.
And Slovenia has introduced legislation, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
I believe it has, but I don't believe, I know somebody said to me the other day that they'd seen an enforcement decision from Slovenia under GDPR. I was somewhat skeptical. I have tried to look on the Slovenian Data Protection Authority's website, and unfortunately it's experiencing technical difficulties, which doesn't bode well. I know that they've been fairly active in things like guidance around employee emails, in guidance around COVID, which is a regional activity, if you like, and criticizing the Slovenian government. But I don't see any enforcement activity from there as yet.
Well, I would tell everyone out there who's watching this, if you are following these issues, if you are tracking enforcement actions, go to the Cordery site, look at the Cordery alerts, subscribe to those alerts. They're always coming out with new information to stay abreast of all these developments in the EU and the UK. And with that, Jonathan, I want to thank you as always. It's always great to have you join us on the guide, especially for a birthday.
Sure.
We are 33. My son's going to wonder why there's silly string all over his playroom now. But we'll get that cleaned up later. But GDPR, if we can say, we hope you have the best birthday ever. We look forward to watching you grow and develop. We're so proud of you as you move into your 3rd year. And for all of you watching, please, if you like this content, we come out with new videos every week. So please subscribe, hit the notification bell to get notified when new content comes out. And of course, give us a thumbs up if you so choose, share and comment. And with that, this is Matt from ESI Survival Guide. And from me to you, please Stay safe out there in the electronic wilderness. See you next time.